In 1907, at the edge of Central Park, New York opened a building that was never meant to be temporary. The Plaza Hotel was designed to outlast the people who entered it, a place where presidents stayed, families lived for decades, and wealth learned how to behave like permanence. For much of the 20th century, the Plaza was not just a hotel. It was an institution sustained by continuity, memory, and restraint. And then, without a single act of destruction, without a fire, a scandal, or a public collapse, it was slowly taken apart, not brick by brick, but function by function. By the late 1980s, the Plaza had become something entirely different, still famous, still beautiful, still standing, yet no longer whole. This is not a story about luxury or celebrity. It is the real story of how one of America's most important places survived physically while losing the very thing that once made it matter. If you value long-form, history-driven documentaries like this, take a moment to subscribe and like the video. It helps support this kind of slow storytelling. And before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. This story is rooted in New York, but its pattern reaches far beyond one city. When the Plaza Hotel opened its doors on October 1st, 1907, New York was still learning how to behave like the center of the modern world. The city had wealth, power, and ambition, but it did not yet have permanence. Fortunes were new, industries unstable, and reputations still fragile. What the Plaza represented in that moment was not simply luxury, but arrival. It stood at the corner of Fifth Avenue and Central Park South as a declaration that American wealth no longer needed to imitate Europe quietly. It could announce itself openly, confidently, and without apology. Built in a French Renaissance style, faced in limestone crowned with a green copper roof visible from across the park, the Plaza was designed to be seen before it was ever entered. It did not blend into the city. It imposed itself upon it. From the beginning, the Plaza was not conceived as an ordinary hotel. Its scale alone made that impossible. With nearly 800 rooms, hundreds of private bathrooms at a time when most hotels still relied on shared facilities, telephones in every room, and a pneumatic tube system that moved messages through the building faster than staff could carry them, the Plaza was a technological statement as much as an architectural one. But technology was not the point. Permanence was. The lobby was finished in marble meant to outlast generations. Chandeliers were installed not as decoration, but as fixtures of authority. The palm quartz stained glass ceiling was designed to transform daylight itself into ritual. This was not a place meant to feel temporary, even to guests who stayed only a night. What truly distinguished the Plaza, however, was not its grandeur, but its continuity. Unlike most hotels, it quickly developed a population of permanent residents. Wealthy widows, retired industrialists, families who preferred service and stability over managing private mansions. These were not transient occupants. They lived there for years, sometimes decades. Children grew up in the building. Elderly residents died in suites they had occupied since middle age. Rooms were inherited informally, passed along within families, decorated with personal furniture, photographs, and books. The Plaza was not simply a destination. It was a community contained within walls. This permanence extended to the staff. Doormen, waiters, elevator operators, and housekeepers often worked at the Plaza for their entire careers. Knowledge accumulated quietly. Staff remembered names, preferences, routines. They recognized residents by footstep before faces came into view. They knew which guests required discretion, which expected ceremony, which needed to be left alone. This kind of institutional memory cannot be manufactured. It develops only when people remain long enough for repetition to become instinct. Over time, the Plaza became something rare in New York City, a place where relationships were not transactional, but layered. The social life of the Plaza reflected this depth. Afternoon tea in the Palm Court was not a novelty, it was a daily ritual. Regulars gathered beneath the stained glass, observing subtle changes in light that marked weather and season. Engagements were announced there, reputations were quietly negotiated. The Oak Room and Oak Bar served as masculine spaces where deals were made over heavy meals and stronger drinks, shielded by dark wood paneling and unspoken rules. For decades, women were excluded, not because the hotel was backward for its time, but because it embodied the assumptions of its era with absolute confidence. The Plaza did not follow trends. It enforced norms. Beyond private life, the hotel functioned as a public stage for American power. Presidents stayed there. Foreign heads of state considered it the only acceptable address in New York. Diplomatic meetings, treaty discussions, and corporate negotiations unfolded in suites designed to convey authority without spectacle. The Plaza's reputation guaranteed discretion. Power concentrated there because powerful people expected to find one another within its walls. When Truman Capote hosted his black and white ball in 1966, the event did not elevate the Plaza's status. It confirmed it. The hotel had already been the center. The party merely reminded the country. What is often forgotten is how fragile this kind of institution actually is. The Plaza's strength did not come from ownership or branding. It came from practice, from routines repeated without interruption, from staff who stayed long enough to pass knowledge to the next generation, from residents who treated the building as a social ecosystem rather than a commodity. None of this was guaranteed by law or contract. It persisted only because ownership, for much of the Plaza's early history, understood itself as stewardship rather than extraction. Standards were maintained not because they maximized short-term profit, but because deviation would have broken something that could not easily be repaired. This is why the Plaza felt eternal. Not because it was invincible, but because its decline was invisible while it functioned properly. Institutions do not announce their vulnerability when they are healthy. They feel natural, inevitable. The Plaza gave the impression that it had always existed and always would, that its rituals would repeat indefinitely, that its marble floors would continue to echo with familiar footsteps long after individual lives ended. Guests came and went, but the structure of belonging remained. Yet even at its height, the forces that would later dismantle the Plaza were already present. The land beneath it was among the most valuable in the world. Its name carried enormous brand power. Its physical scale made it attractive not just as a hotel, but as a financial instrument. These pressures remained dormant only as long as owners accepted limits on what could be taken from the building. The Plaza worked because it was allowed to be more than the sum of its parts. The moment that calculation changed, the institution would begin to weaken, not through collapse, but through thinning. By the mid-20th century, New York itself was changing. Corporate management replaced individual stewardship. Efficiency began to compete with tradition. Standardization crept quietly into places that had once thrived on specificity. The Plaza did not fall in this period. It continued to function. The chandeliers still sparkled. The Palm Court still served tea. But institutions rarely die suddenly. They lose depth first. And when depth disappears, what remains can still look intact to outsiders, even as something essential has already begun to slip away. This is the Plaza as it once was. Not a backdrop, not a luxury brand, but a living institution sustained by continuity, memory, and restraint. To understand what happened next, it is essential to understand what was at stake. Because what would eventually be lost was not architecture. It was not prestige. It was something far more difficult to replace once broken. The invisible structure that allowed a place to mean more than what could be bought or sold. The first changes did not arrive as a crisis. There were no scandals, no closures, no visible decline that could be photographed or summarized in headlines. What happened instead was a shift in logic. subtle enough that most guests never noticed it at all. In the decades following World War II, the United States entered a new economic phase defined by scale, standardization, and corporate management. Industries consolidated. Family-controlled enterprises gave way to publicly traded companies. Decision-making moved away from individuals who knew places intimately and toward systems designed to make distant oversight possible. The plaza did not stand apart from these forces, it was absorbed into them. When ownership changed hands in the mid-20th century, the hotel was no longer viewed primarily as an institution to be maintained across generations, but as an operation to be optimized. This was not presented as abandonment of tradition, but as modernization. Efficiency was framed as responsibility. Consistency was framed as professionalism. The language sounded reasonable, even reassuring. Hotels, after all, were businesses. They had costs, revenues, and competitive pressures. And yet what made the plaza exceptional had never been reducible to metrics. Its value lived in continuity, in the accumulation of memory, habit, and informal knowledge that no spreadsheet could capture. Under corporate management, the plaza began to resemble other large hotels in ways that were difficult to articulate but easy to feel. Departments were reorganized, reporting structures were standardized. Long-standing practices that had evolved organically were replaced with procedures designed to be replicated across multiple properties. This did not immediately destroy the plaza's character, but it diluted it. Institutional memory depends on people staying long enough to remember why things are done a certain way. When staff turnover increases, that memory thins. When policies replace judgment, discretion erodes. The hotel continued to function, but the invisible scaffolding that had supported its uniqueness began to weaken. For permanent residents, the change was more noticeable. These were people who had chosen the plaza not for novelty, but for stability. They had built their lives around predictable rhythms, familiar faces at the front desk, staff who knew their histories, routines that had remained intact for decades. As management philosophies shifted, those rhythms began to break. Familiar employees disappeared, replaced by workers trained to follow rules rather than inherit traditions. Requests that had once been handled informally now required approval. Small accommodations that had once been gestures of belonging became exceptions that needed justification. The building was still beautiful. The service was still polite. But the sense of being known began to fade. This was not malicious. It was structural. Corporate ownership does not aim to destroy institutions, it aims to manage them. But management, by definition, prioritizes what can be measured. Occupancy rates matter more than relationships. Cost control matters more than continuity. In this framework, the plaza's greatest strength, its depth, became its greatest inconvenience. Depth resists standardization. It requires patience. It depends on people staying put in a labor market increasingly designed to encourage mobility. The very qualities that had made the plaza feel timeless were now liabilities within a system that rewarded flexibility and short-term performance. At the same time, the broader city was changing. New York in the 1960s and 1970s faced economic pressures that strained even its most iconic institutions. Manufacturing declined, crime rose, wealthy families relocated to suburbs, tourism fluctuated, maintaining an aging, labor-intensive building became more expensive each year. The plaza's ornate interiors required constant care. Its systems needed updating. Its chandeliers, marble and woodwork demanded specialized maintenance that newer hotels simply did not require. From a purely financial perspective, the plaza was becoming difficult to justify in its existing form. And yet, outwardly, the hotel still projected success. Films continued to use it as shorthand for wealth and sophistication. Social events still filled the ballroom. Visitors still took photographs beneath the chandeliers. This visibility masked the internal tension between what the plaza was and what it was becoming. Institutions often appear strongest just before their logic changes entirely. Familiarity breeds confidence, and confidence delays scrutiny. As long as the facade held, few questioned whether the structure beneath it was being altered. The crucial transformation during this period was conceptual rather than physical. The plaza began to be understood less as a social ecosystem and more as a collection of assets: rooms, square footage, location, brand. The land beneath it, sitting at one of the most valuable intersections in the world, became impossible to ignore. The question was no longer how to preserve the institution, but how to extract greater value from it. This shift did not require hostility toward the plaza's past. It required only a different definition of responsibility. Stewardship looks forward cautiously, constrained by what must be protected. Ownership looks inward analytically, constrained only by what can be monetized. Landmark designation, which would later be celebrated as a victory for preservation, emerged in part because of this tension. The city recognized that the plaza's architectural significance needed protection from alteration or demolition. Limestone facades, historic rooms, and decorative elements were granted legal status that limited what owners could change. But landmark laws protect objects, not practices. They preserve spaces, not cultures. They cannot mandate continuity of staff or safeguard the relationships that once defined daily life inside the building. The plaza's physical shell gained protection just as its institutional core became more vulnerable. By the late 1970s, the hotel still stood proudly, but its identity had begun to drift. It was no longer quite what it had been, yet not obviously something else. Guests who remembered earlier decades sensed a loss they could not easily describe. New visitors, lacking that memory, saw only elegance. This asymmetry is how institutional decline often proceeds. It is most visible to those who were there before, and almost invisible to those encountering the place for the first time. What made the plaza particularly susceptible at this stage was its fame. Reputation attracts attention, and attention attracts speculation. Investors do not need to love an institution to value it. They need only recognize that others do. By the end of the 1970s, the plaza was no longer just a hotel operating in New York. It was a global symbol, a name with financial weight. And once a place becomes a symbol, it becomes portable. It can be bought, sold, leveraged, and reimagined by people who have never lived inside its rhythms. This is the moment where the story begins to turn decisively, not because anything collapsed, but because the conditions that once protected the plaza no longer existed. The hotel had survived wars, depressions, and social change because those events did not fundamentally alter how it was understood. What changed now was the understanding itself. The plaza was no longer primarily a place to be preserved through continuity. It was a property to be repositioned. And once that shift occurs, every decision that follows is shaped by a different question. Not what does this place mean, but what can this place become? By the time the next era arrived, the plaza would still look intact to the casual observer. The marble would still gleam. The chandeliers would still glow. But the logic guiding its future would be entirely different. What had once been protected by restraint was about to be tested by ambition, and the transformation that followed would not require demolition, only debt. When the plaza entered the 1980s, it did so carrying an identity that was already partially detached from its origins. The institution still existed, but it no longer defined the decisions being made about it. What mattered now was not continuity, but leverage. The decade ushered in a new financial logic across the United States, one that treated iconic properties not as long-term responsibilities, but as vehicles for accelerated return. Debt became a tool rather than a warning. Assets were no longer valued primarily for what they produced steadily over time, but for what could be unlocked immediately through restructuring, subdivision, and sale. In this environment, the plaza was no longer merely attractive. It was irresistible. The acquisition of the hotel in the late 1980s marked a decisive break from the past, not because of the personality of any one owner, but because of the financial structure imposed on the building itself. The plaza was purchased using heavy leverage, meaning its future was immediately constrained by the need to service debt rather than preserve function. From that moment on, every decision inside the hotel answered to a clock. Interest payments did not wait for tradition. Loan terms did not account for institutional memory. The building could no longer be allowed to exist primarily as a place where meaning accumulated slowly. It had to begin paying for itself faster than it ever had before. What followed was not destruction in the obvious sense. The plaza was not torn down. Its facade was not altered beyond recognition. Its most famous rooms were not erased. Instead, something more precise occurred. The building was subdivided, both physically and conceptually. Portions of the hotel were converted into luxury condominiums, sold individually at prices that reflected prestige rather than function. Space that had once supported shared life, long-term residence, staff routines, informal social zones, was carved into private units optimized for ownership rather than belonging. The plaza did not lose square footage. It lost cohesion. This transformation was presented publicly as preservation through reinvention. Condominiums were framed as a way to keep the building financially viable. Luxury retail was framed as a natural extension of prestige. None of these arguments were false on their own, but they obscured a deeper truth. Institutions cannot survive when their internal logic is broken into competing interests. A hotel depends on flow, continuity, and service relationships that stretch across the entire building. Condominiums depend on privacy, exclusivity, and separation. When these two logics coexist under one roof, the institution does not adapt. It fragments. For staff, the change was immediate and disorienting. Roles that had once existed to support long-term residents and recurring guests became redundant. Services were reduced or eliminated. Institutional knowledge, built over decades, had no place in a structure that prioritized turnover and resale. Employees who had spent their lives inside the plaza found themselves unnecessary, not because they had failed, but because the building no longer required what they provided. This was not a layoff cycle. It was an erasure of purpose. When people leave an institution under these conditions, they do not take memories with them voluntarily. They take them because there is nowhere left to use them. The physical experience of the plaza began to change in subtle but telling ways. Circulation patterns shifted. Areas that had once felt public became restricted. Elevators were reassigned. Entrances were separated. The building developed internal borders invisible to outsiders, but deeply felt by those who worked within it. What had once been a single organism became a collection of zones with different rules, priorities, and futures. Guests might still pass through the lobby and feel impressed, but the sense of an integrated whole was gone. The plaza still looked like itself. It no longer behaved like itself. Financial pressure accelerated this process. When a building is burdened by debt, time compresses. There is no patience for slow returns or intangible value. Decisions must justify themselves quickly or they are replaced. In this environment, tradition becomes an obstacle. Ritual becomes inefficiency. Anything that cannot be monetized directly is vulnerable. The plaza's history, which had once been its foundation, now functioned primarily as marketing. It was invoked to sell units, attract buyers, and justify prices, but not to shape operations. The past was preserved as image, not as practice. This is the critical distinction that defines the extraction years. Preservation did not fail. It succeeded. On the surface, the chandeliers remained. The palm court was restored. The limestone facade was cleaned and protected. From the outside, the plaza appeared to have survived intact. But institutions are not made of stone. They are made of relationships, repetition, and shared expectations. Those elements cannot be landmarked. They cannot be regulated into existence. Once they are disrupted beyond a certain point, they do not return simply because the building remains beautiful. Public perception lagged behind reality. The plaza continued to symbolize wealth and success in popular culture. Films and photographs reinforced its image as a place of privilege. But symbols are forgiving. They do not reveal what has been removed beneath them. Visitors encountered a space curated for impression rather than participation. Luxury remained, but it had become static. The hotel no longer absorbed people into its rhythms. It displayed itself to them. By the end of this period, the transformation was complete. The plaza still stood, famous as ever, protected by law and admired by millions. Yet the institution that had once justified its scale no longer existed. What remained was a hybrid structure, part hotel, part private residence, part financial instrument, held together not by continuity, but by contracts. The building survived because it could be divided. The institution died because it could not. This outcome was not inevitable in the abstract, but it was unavoidable once the logic of extraction took hold. Places designed to accumulate meaning over time cannot survive when time itself becomes the enemy. Debt accelerates everything. It forces choices that favor immediacy over memory. And when an institution like the plaza is placed inside that system, it does not collapse spectacularly. It empties quietly, one function at a time, until only the shell remains. By the early 1990s, the plaza had completed its transition from institution to asset. It was still admired, still photographed, still invoked as a symbol of American luxury. But symbols can survive without substance. What had been lost was not visible to most people, which is why the loss went largely unremarked. The building did not disappear. It simply stopped being what it once was. And that is the most efficient kind of erasure there is. What survived the transformation of the Plaza Hotel is easy to see. The limestone facade still catches the light along Central Park South. The copper roof still signals prestige from a distance. The palm court remains carefully restored, its glass ceiling filtering daylight exactly as it did a century earlier. The chandeliers still hang. The marble still reflects footsteps. From the outside, and even from many of its interiors, the plaza appears intact, protected, polished, and preserved. In a purely architectural sense, it succeeded. It was saved from demolition, shielded by landmark laws, and maintained at a level few historic buildings ever achieve. By the standards of preservation policy, the story ends here, labeled a victory. But institutions are not preserved the same way buildings are. What made the plaza matter was never reducible to materials or design. It lived in continuity, in the way residents stayed long enough to become part of the place, in the way staff accumulated knowledge that could not be written down, in the way routines repeated until they felt permanent. Those qualities do not survive subdivision. They do not survive debt. They do not survive a system that treats space primarily as something to be monetized rather than inhabited. When the plaza was broken into components, hotel rooms, private residences, retail frontage, it lost the conditions required for institutional life. What remained was architecture performing the memory of an institution that no longer existed. Today, the plaza functions, but it does not cohere. Guests arrive, stay briefly and leave. Owners occupy apartments that are insulated from the hotel's rhythms rather than integrated into them. Staff serve efficiently, but without the long-term relationships that once defined their roles. There is no longer a population that belongs to the building in a continuous way. The plaza no longer absorbs lives into itself. It hosts transactions. The difference is subtle, but profound. A place can be beautiful, expensive, and famous, and still feel hollow when continuity is gone. This is why the plaza now feels strangely quiet, even when it is full. Not quiet in the sense of sound, but in the sense of depth. The building no longer accumulates shared memory. Nothing lingers. Events happen, but they do not layer. Guests photograph the same spaces where history once unfolded organically, but the meaning does not compound. The plaza has become a stage set that performs luxury convincingly, while remaining detached from the lives moving through it. What was once lived in is now observed. The landmark protections that saved the plaza's exterior and select interiors were never designed to preserve this deeper dimension. Laws can protect facades, prohibit demolition, and regulate alterations, but they cannot mandate belonging. They cannot require staff to stay, residents to commit, or owners to think beyond the next financial cycle. Preservation froze the plaza in time visually, but time continued moving through it socially. The result is a building that looks eternal while feeling temporary. This outcome is not unique to the plaza. It is part of a broader American pattern in which institutions are preserved as images after they cease to function as systems. Grand hotels, department stores, theaters, and public spaces survive because they are too symbolic to destroy, but too valuable to leave whole. They are hollowed out carefully, their most photogenic elements retained while their social cores are dismantled. What replaces them is not nothing. It is something thinner, something that performs continuity without requiring it. The plaza's story matters because it exposes this process clearly. The building did not decline because people stopped caring. It declined because caring was replaced by calculation. Once the plaza became primarily a financial object, everything that could not be priced directly became expendable. Long-term residents were inefficient. Institutional memory was non-transferable. Continuity was fragile. These were not errors within the system. They were obstacles to it. And so they were removed without drama, without outrage, and largely without notice. This is why the plaza does not feel haunted by what happened there, but by what no longer can. It is haunted by the absence of accumulation, by the knowledge that the same rituals cannot repeat long enough to matter again. The building still hosts wealth, but it no longer hosts permanence. It still represents prestige, but not belonging. It still stands at one of the most powerful intersections in the world, but it no longer anchors a living institution to that place. In the end, the plaza did not fail. It adapted exactly as the system demanded. It survived by becoming divisible, marketable, and efficient. What it lost was not a function, but a role. It ceased to be a place where lives could unfold slowly and became a place where value could be extracted quickly. That transformation left the structure standing and the institution gone. This is the quiet lesson the plaza offers. Not that wealth destroys history outright, but that it often preserves the surface while erasing the conditions that gave the surface meaning. Not that landmarks are useless, but that they protect appearances better than they protect continuity. And not that places like the plaza disappear, but that they can remain visible long after they stop being alive. The plaza still stands, photographed endlessly, admired globally, invoked as a symbol of American luxury. But symbols do not need institutions to survive. They need only recognition. What was lost cannot be rebuilt through restoration or branding because it depended on time, restraint, and people staying put. Those are not qualities modern systems reward for long. And that is why the Plaza's story is ultimately darker than it appears. Because nothing dramatic had to happen. No fire, no collapse, no scandal. The building was saved. It was protected. It was polished. And yet, something essential passed quietly out of it. Something that cannot be landmarked, cannot be replicated, and cannot be bought back once it's gone.